New frontiers for growth is the theme for this year. How do you see the dialogues going at a time, obviously, when there is a bit of a bifurcated geopolitical situation and economy over those last 5 years? Are the discussions going to be a little bit different than in years past?
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, we're also happy to be back after 5 years in Dalian for the annual meeting of the new champions, Summer Davos. This is overall our 15th time we're doing this second largest gathering that we have annually. And the topic, New Frontiers of Growth, is really related to the format of this meeting traditionally. It's always been basically 3 meetings in one. It's always been a global meeting, always an Asia meeting, and always a China meeting. And finding new sources of growth, next frontiers of growth, is relevant to all 3 dimensions. The global economy is going to be front and center here. Kristalina Georgieva said that if we don't find new sources of growth, we'll look back at this decade as the tepid 20s. So we are in a low growth environment historically with 3% growth, as you know. And so really it's so important that we have this platform around the global economy at this quite a fragile time. Of course, some people say, okay, we will have maybe not the hard landing this year as we have some expected, but long term it is clear that we need to find new sources of productivity and growth. And then, of course, the Asia dimension within this tepid growth globally. 2/3 of global growth last year and 2/3 of global growth this year is expected to come from Asia. So we are in growth markets, and so it's so important that we have leaders from Asia here, as well as, of course, other geographies around the world.
Well, given the headwinds, obviously, in the domestic economy here that are tied to more geopolitical issues as well, is there going to be a lot of hope, would you say, that China can still, despite its fairly lackluster growth so far, the engine for global growth?
Yeah, I think what is going to be at the core of the meeting is really this situation of 2 worlds, if you will. On one hand, you have, of course, as you mentioned, a more complicated geopolitical environment globally, a more competitive geoeconomics, if you will, and that's something that I think people will agree we've entered, if not a new era, it is a transition to something new where we see more competitive relations. But at the same time, we really live in the best of times as well, you could argue, in terms of the number of transformative technologies, not only within the digital economy, but also, for example, energy transition technologies and others that could really unlock new productivity for sustainable and inclusive growth. So it's really about the balance of how do you make sure you navigate the new geopolitical environment, but at the same time are able to take advantage of some of these opportunities for increased productivity, inclusion, and sustainability.
Not to continue to take the devil's advocate position, but that's my job as a journalist, obviously. But the problem, again, is this inclusive growth. How does that happen in areas like AI and climate change technologies when the world is becoming increasingly bifurcated, in isolation?
Yeah. No, I think, of course, it is, and you also saw it at the annual meeting in Davos. These are transformative issues, transformative technologies. They have huge upside. At the same time, we work a lot with all stakeholders also to manage the risks and look at what are the guardrails that need to be put in place. If you take AI, of course, there is a lot of dialogue on that. So we're quite clear-eyed, and you will see here also at this meeting in Dalian, we're really putting this multi-stakeholder model to work to make sure that we have a realistic view of those issues. But it is, I think, there is a consensus that the upside is very considerable. And you asked about China, so you see decision makers around the world, including in China, of course, looking at also clean tech, of course, high tech, looking at those things in terms of how can it unlock new productivity and new growth.
And that goes back to my overall theme of questioning, and that is new productive forces is what's being pushed by the Chinese government. But that, too, has caused some consternation in the West because of the rise of protectionism, in particular in the new 3 that Xi Jinping has advocated. That is solar power, obviously EVs, and batteries. But it's created tension. We have the German vice chancellor in China this week, trying to diffuse that kind of tension. So I think the stakes are pretty high, right, with new productive forces as being an engine of growth for China, but a source of consternation in the West.
So I work with leaders from around the world. I also happen to work a lot in Europe. And if I look at it, and it's really, you see decision makers, be they leaders of businesses or leaders of governments, really grappling with the same issues in terms of, we again have really a huge economic transformation, huge changes in the global economy, huge changes in the business models. And so it is really, how do you, again, navigate this more competitive environment? How do you, if you are a country, and this is not only in China but elsewhere, how do you manage your economic sovereignty and economic security, but at the same time, how do you ensure that you are able to have productive relations with the rest of the world? So these are things that are, I would argue, not unique, for example, to the Chinese economy. We see it also with other decision makers around the world. And if I were to really zero in on the key issues, if you, for example, even look at Europe, the key issues are really managing the energy transition. How do you make sure that you marry the green economy with competitiveness in the future? And then, of course, it's high-tech and AI. And so both those issues, let's say high-tech, AI, and the energy transition and the intersection, is at the heart of the competitiveness of the future, and it is, of course, relevant here, but it is also relevant in other geographies.
It's really managing the competition that has really kind of escalated to the point of the rise in protectionism. And we've seen that in Europe with the rise of more right-wing, more conservative, more nationalist lawmakers, which simply complicates the dialogue of globalization, right? Which is really key to this part in this meeting here.
I think if I look at it, for example, if you look at what is taking place in terms of economic diplomacy, for example, you mentioned Vice Chancellor Habeck, but also if you look, for example, at the visits and the number of visits in the U.S.-China relationship, we've seen over the past year number of U.S. officials here, then of course also Chinese officials there. We saw the summit in San Francisco between the two presidents. So, of course, again, we are in this new environment, but I think what we also need to acknowledge that there is a lot of these leaders are trying to figure it out. So they're trying to figure out the swim lanes in terms of, okay, this is a little bit of a moving target. All these technologies, new opportunities. At the same time, we have, let's say, changing geopolitics. But I have to say that I do see genuine efforts to figure it out. You saw that Habeck was here. You also saw there was a call, Dombrovskis with his counterpart in China. Now they have a formal dialogue on EVs, on the U.S.-China relationship, a number of things that have been worked on the economic front over the past year. So I think, again, what is important is that, number one, you see officials that are conducting this economic diplomacy. And again, zeroing in back to this meeting, we are a multi-stakeholder platform, global. We will have leaders from around the world here focusing on the global economy. And a lot of the dialogues here will also focus on some of these issues that are pertinent to these very important economic relationships for the global economy.
Mirek,